Hello, and welcome everyone. I'm Todd Fernandez with Climate Crisis Policy and the Earth Bowl Network. I'll be your host today. Thank you so much for being here. We have a full lineup with great expertise and a lot to cover. We'll start with an update on the Earth Bill, welcoming back Francesco Arreaga from Representative Espaillat's office, who is spearheading the task of getting the bill through Legislative Council and ready for introduction. And then we'll have Chad Frischmann, formerly of Project Drawdown, now with a new enterprise called Regenintel. We're very grateful that the experts with Regenintel are working on a greenhouse gas analysis of the Earth Bill, and we'll get a preliminary overview of that process. Following this, we'll have Mahajan from Energy Innovation, who will take us further into the science of greenhouse gas modeling, focusing on the Inflation Reduction Act. After these, we're going to shift gears to welcome Sarah Carden from Farm Action Fund, who will give us an overview of the Farm Bill process and key demands and organizing plans. Before we start the agenda, I'll share a few general updates. As everyone knows, the climate movement had a considerable victory in passing the Inflation Reduction Act with $369 billion of investments and a right-of-way of incentives to propel the transition to renewable energy. There's a lot to say about this and lots of discussions about poison pills in the bill. For one, they tied clean energy permitting to fossil fuel leasing on public lands and waters. This provision felt like a punch to the gut at the end of a long marathon. And yet we got back up and we finished the race. So kudos again to everyone who worked so hard on this. And thank you to the New York activists who rose up again toward the end of that journey, holding meetings with Senator Schumer's staff and at his home and office. It really mattered, I think. And big appreciation to all the coalitions involved, led by the Climate Action Campaign and the 100% Clean Energy Coalition, with special appreciation to the team at Chesapeake Climate Action Network, who inspired us all to keep grassroots action in play. It was a long, hard-fought battle with deep organizing that has formed tight bonds among organizers across a vast range of groups. Politically, the bottom line is that the bill still reflects the status quo power of the fossil fuel industry in Congress, which is so powerful, it can prevent even a discussion of banning greenhouse gases. While we watch in real time the planet scorching, rivers evaporating, floods and fires raging, and that is real power, the power to destroy our planet for the love of money and to prevent us from stopping them. But the climate movement is coalescing and creating movement and structure that can change this. Coalitions are forming and solidifying that are open, inclusive, and more transparent, and the collective advocacy efforts and capacity is growing. There's still a long way to go here, but this is all very important progress, because once this cause is really in full collective motion, it will be powerful enough to change the political status quo and topple the oligarchy that controls our government. I personally believe the climate crisis presents a unique opportunity in this regard because of the stakes at issue, the passion to fix it, and the breadth and depth of civil society and public engagement ready to be unleashed. But we will all need to align our demands and work together to realize this potential. Fortunately, it seems that everyone acknowledges that the IRA is just the beginning. A down payment on the kind of policy we'll need to categorically stop greenhouse gas pollution on a timeline to save the future for our children. And everyone is moving on to next fronts with a big focus on the EPA and rulemaking. As you probably know, there is now also a full court press led by People's versus Fossil Fuel campaign to stop a permitting reform bill, which was a side deal to the IRA. We sent out all the organizing materials for actions and lobbying, and I'll touch more on this in between speakers. I'm personally still reading that draft bill, and there's a question of whether that's even the real or final draft. And I'm looking for experts on federal permitting to help explain what this bill does and changing current practices. We'll see what we can pull together. But generally, permitting reform is an extremely important issue to enable faster build out of renewable capacity. But the permitting process is also the main power communities have to stop dirty infrastructure. So this conversation needs and deserves a deliberative, inclusive, and transparent process, not only because it directly impacts communities, but also because we can't just pave the way for new fossil fuel projects, obviously. So the details of the bill matter. People versus Fossil Fuels is determined to stop it categorically, and key leaders are joining that call. The goal is to uncouple it from the budget continuing resolution process that has to pass the House by the end of September or the government shuts down. And that's reportedly the vehicle for this bill. There are lobbying efforts going on and a September 8th rally in DC led by the Appalachian groups. And everyone is welcome to join those efforts directly Please see the email I sent out for all the details. As with all these things, our role here is to provide information and to join and uplift the rallying cry to activism. And then each group and activist can make their own decision on which parts to join. There are no perfect answers in these arenas. And for now, in this formative stage, to my mind, it's more important that we learn to work together despite differences of opinion so that we can build power for the bigger fights ahead. I will end and transition by saying that it is wonderful, really, and unusual in law and policy debates that we have science as a tool for this discussion. So counting greenhouse gases emissions and projecting those impacts from laws is a great way to cut through the often very serious conundrums and compromises inherent in lawmaking and political strategy. So I'm very excited for today's conversation. The more we understand the basis for greenhouse gas modeling of policy, the better we can embrace and rely on this as part of the movement demand setting process. And it'll also be key as we implement policy so we can measure the success in real time, which is critical to knowing if we're on course. Before we jump into all that, we're going to have an update, start with an update on the Earth Bill. For anyone new, the Earth Bill will mandate a shift to 100% renewable energy, zero emission vehicles, and regenerative agriculture by Big Ag by 2030. This approach is a paradigm shift that basically puts the people in charge of our industrial practices and affirms the power of Congress to create laws for the public welfare. This directly confronts the powerful oligarchies and their polluting ways by calling the ultimate question of who gets to set our pollution policies and who is in charge, the people or the corporations. By linking fossil fuels and agriculture, we are tackling the two biggest powers in the world, which makes it harder, but it also provides the opportunity for activists across these passions to unite for collective power. And thus it offers a possible path to victory against tremendous odds. We call this a moonshot for Earth because the unity required to pass it and the politics against it are tremendous. But the goal of stopping greenhouse gas pollution in these three areas is the right answer. It's based on worldwide scientific consensus that these three solutions are required. And I imagine everyone would be thrilled if we could snap our fingers and accomplish this and wake up tomorrow with it done. So we're setting the sights high, hoping that the truth of the solution will inspire a miracle. As you know, Representative Espaillat has stepped up to be the lead sponsor of the bill, and we've been working since April to get the language through the House Legislative Council process. And I'm happy to report that as of Monday, we have a very final, very near final version, which has reignited hope that we're near the end of the beginning of this journey. I hope Francesco's with us.
Francesco's not here yet, Todd.
Oh, he's not. Okay.
No.
Well, that's very odd. So, well, that's the primary update. So Francesco makes it great. He was due to come here and update us on all of this today. And we're reworking one part of the definition that came out of that process a little bit contorted on the ag piece. And so we're in constant contact about that. So I don't know, sure what, oh, his Zoom is not working. He's having an issue with Zoom.
Okay.
I got a report back. So Greg, if you have phone numbers for dial-in for this call that we could send Francesco, that would be great. If you put them in the chat, I'll send them to him.
Okay.
I'm going to tell him we're trying to get him a phone number in a minute. All right, so then, Chad, I see that you're already here. We'll get Francesco those phone numbers. And I told him in the infrastructure bill that they passed, they should have put some money in it to upgrade the Zoom capacity of the congressional offices. It's a very serious problem. They're on their own cell phones half the time. So anyhow, with that said, I want to welcome Chad, have an opening with Chad. Chad of Regenintel now, formerly with Project Drawdown, where he led a team of global experts to create an incredible book, Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. That list of 100 sources and greenhouse gases was the foundation for the Climate Crisis Policy Digest and was a huge source of motivation to me when first trying to understand the problem and solutions in this arena. We use this list of sources as the outline for the digest and then summarize policy ideas from over 100 expert reports to show alignment on solutions. All of this was a foundation for building unity. And then the digest ended up being a foundation for the House's climate crisis report and has then led to the Earth Bill's focus on electricity, cars, and food. So when you really undertake something as fundamental as what you did and as comprehensive as what you did, Chad, I don't think you could ever foresee really how valuable it's going to be to the overall thing, but I think you knew it. You did the right thing, and it's really a basis for all of our work. So thank you, and thank you for all you've done, and especially thank you for stepping up and volunteering to help us get a handle on the greenhouse gas impacts of the Earth Bill. Please take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much, Todd, and thank you all for joining us and being so instrumental in creating the Earth Bill. It's such an important piece of legislation to create that kind of inspiration that we need to instill in our congressional leaders to take action sooner than later, because we are in a climate emergency. And as Todd mentioned, and thank you for that kind introduction, of course, my background is working with one of the co-creators of Project Drawdown and actually leading our design of the solutions framework at Drawdown, and of course all of the rigorous modeling and methodology we use and research we did to aggregate and collect humanity's knowledge about solutions that actually work today, and seeing how they can have an impact on sources, sinks, and society into the future. And actually, one of my colleagues, Ryan Allard, is also on the call today, and possibly another one of my colleagues, Mamta, if she was able to join us. But recently, I left Project Drawdown after 8 years of leading our solutions team, and have embarked upon a new journey called Regenerative Intelligence, where we are activating humanity to become a planet-positive species to create the regenerative future. And to doing that, like, how do we take that knowledge about what are real solutions today that can solve for our climate crisis, but also have cascading benefits to solve our sustainable development goals, and ultimately move that system forward to a regenerative economy and society that we need for the future, for humanity to live in concert with the planet, where well-being for humanity and the planet are the core of what we do as a species. And that's what we're doing at Regenintel. But one of the things we do at Regenintel is evaluate. We do assessments on investments, projects, companies, and policies to determine what are their climate targets and are they in line with the impact that they hope to achieve. How those policies are also aligned with sustainable development targets, and then ultimately, are they aligned with regenerative principles? And so we were really, amongst other things we do at Regenintel, but I'll focus on that because I want to keep it relatively short. I know there's a lot to cover today. But that's where I think, Todd reached out to me, and from all the past conversations that we've had around solutions that work. And the science and data behind those solutions. Because at the core of what we did at Drawdown and what we do at Regenintel is look at the data, look at the science, and make pretty conservative estimations of what potential impact can be at the scale and the ambitions. We want to be as ambitious as possible, but relatively conservative about what those impacts are, because that's the best case scenario, right? If we're super ambitious and really conservative on the impact, all that means is that the impact could be a lot better than what we aim for. So that's kind of the approach we took at Drawdown, and we take at Regenintel. Now, what Todd has asked us to do, and we're in the midst of doing this analysis now with my team at Regenintel, again, inclusive of Ryan and Mamta, who are on the call with us today. But we'll be evaluating some of the key provisions in the bill, as Todd elucidated, the movement to 100% clean renewable electricity in the United States by 2030, meeting those targets that are set in the bill. Same with going to 100% electric vehicles for passenger vehicles and light duty trucks and the provisions of the bill, as well as 100% regenerative agriculture. Now, these are obviously it's very challenging to do this at this scale, as data is always new data is always coming our way. But what we're doing is we're evaluating what is the current market for electricity, what are expected trajectories for some of the key technologies to achieve that renewable energy systems in the United States that are relevant for the US context. Same with the electric vehicles, same with the regenerative agriculture, looking at agroecological zones in the United States. What are the baseline that we're working with today? And then we're using sort of current data on emissions factors for different types of technologies that we see are pivotal in the United States in the context we're operating. And we're going to, be very ambitious, as Todd pointed out, very ambitious with our adoption cases, because it is very ambitious to reach 100% clean renewable electricity, EVs, and regen ag by 2030 is incredibly ambitious. But we need to see what is possible when we really push the levels at the maximum forward. But we're going to be conservative about those impacts to make sure that we are, and by conservative, I mean, we're not going to cherry pick data to be particularly beneficial or particularly detrimental to the bill. We're going to go right in the middle to try to collect as much data as we can and use really solid estimates of what those emission factors could be. And that's going to give us a rough estimation of what the potential emissions reductions can be by 2030. And so our team is working on that now. And the only thing that I would say is that it is quite challenging, I'd say, particularly in the agricultural space. And I think maybe Todd has indicated that there's been some movement or changes in sort of the definitions, which we would love to know more about, because what kind of regenerative agricultural practices fit within the context of the United States is different than other parts of the world, obviously. So we're going to have different kinds of regenerative practices that we can lump together. So that is going to be probably the most complicated of the actual modeling. It's how we do the ag piece. But we look at it as a whole system as well. So what is the impact of the adoption of clean renewable energy on the rest of the system? So we'll be looking at sort of a rough estimation of emissions reductions potentials for the built environment, for industry, and for other sectors in the US to see that cascading benefit of going to 100% clean renewable electricity. Of course, factoring in also the increased electricity we will need to supply when we electrify everything. If we electrify 100% electric vehicles, well, we're going to have to demand more electricity. So that means there's going to be more solar, more wind that are required to reach that 100% renewable energy system of the future. And so we want to make sure we balance that out. So this is kind of what we're up to now. I know I've probably spent already too much time talking about this. Happy to answer some questions. I know we only have about 7 minutes left in this call. Todd, I'm happy to answer questions or comments, but also pass it on to the next speaker in the lineup.
Well, looks like we have a question. So we'll take a couple, and then we have Francesco's joined us. So we definitely want to get to him, and then we'll wrap up this segment by 12:30-ish. Let's first of all, thank you for undertaking this. It's very exciting. It's been sort of a long-term dream, and it's very exciting that we're at this level of it happening. So I'll just let Mary Jane ask a question. Go ahead, Mary Jane.
Mary, you're on mute.
Sorry, Chad. I have seen more and more references in the press to regenerative agriculture, and I'm very interested in the topic, so I'm aware of it. And it seems as though there is increasing interest and maybe increasing participation, but I never see anything other than anecdotal information. Could you have an idea of what percentage of our agricultural product comes from regenerative farms?
Oh, currently in the United States, a relatively small percentage, and it's how you define regenerative agriculture. There are a lot of different practices that can be deemed regenerative. And the word regenerative in agriculture is very complicated because it's very contextually based, because it's based on soil type, soil dynamics, and climate. And so one application of regenerative agriculture in one part of the state could be different in a different part of the state. So it's hard to be very clear. So some of those anecdotal things you might hear are anecdotes from specific sites. But what we do is collect a lot of data from peer-reviewed, widely cited studies that look at a multitude of different sites in different parts of both the United States, but more broadly the world, to give us a more variable range of possible, say, sequestration rates, how it affects climate, but also yield and other indicators of a regenerative system. So it's just to say it's very different. So you may hear bits and bombs from different specific sites, but going to the peer-reviewed literature is a good source for like understanding scientifically what the potential sequestration is for these types of projects broadly, but understanding that it's not going to be the same everywhere. So it's going to be highly variable. That's why agriculture, it's about the soil itself. So it's going to be variable depending on soil and climate. In terms of adoption, again, it depends on the type of practice. For conservation agriculture, for example, which is I would consider like the very basic level of going towards a fully regenerative system, but a conservation ag in the US has a relatively high uptake, up to, I don't know what the current, off the top of my head, what the current numbers are, to be honest, my apologies, but, we're looking at somewhere between 30% doing some form of conservation ag, but that's at the bare minimum. And so what we will be looking at, for example, in the assessment of this bill is how much of the big ag can pivot more towards the conservation ag, because it's a little bit easier to do because there's already momentum in the market, right, to go to conservation ag. And then what part can then move from conservation ag and then transition to a fully more regenerative system as they take on more practices that go beyond just conservation ag. So we'll be looking at some of these transition approaches within the context of regen ag. But just to say, most regenerative agriculture is not necessarily certainly not a predominant or majority of production in the US. Certain parts of the country, like organic practices or biodynamic practices that are on the East Coast, tend to be a bit more closer to regenerative than organic practices in California or the West Coast. So again, even when you have these practices like organic, depending on where you are in the state and the types of regulations that are in certifications of how you become organic, are going to be different in different parts of even the country. So it's a very complex thing where we try to simplify. Sorry, Todd.
I'm going to jump in. I'm going to jump in if I can, Mary. I need to stop us now, unfortunately, because we have so much to do in a tight schedule. But I hope you all got from that answer an indication that we have real experts on our team and doing this work. And when next time Chad is with us, it will be an in-depth report back on their analysis, and we will cover all of these elements. I just want to thank you, Chad, and ask you if you want to stay with us for a minute while Francesco comes on. I want to invite Francesco and have him give his update, and then see if there are any last-minute questions after that. Francesco, welcome. Are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Well, thank you again for being here, Francesco Arreaga, whose name I probably always mess up. One day you're going to have to teach me how to say it. Is working tirelessly to get this bill through the process at the Legislative Counsel's office, and has been an incredible ally. And so I'm so grateful. Thank you. And thank you for all your work. Thank you for being here again today. What's the latest?
Well, first of all, thank you all for all you're doing to work on this bill, the Earth bill. It's so important. And thank you, Todd, for all your efforts, as always. Very appreciative to you. Right now, we have received an update from Leg Council. They have sent us an updated version of the bill with just a few last questions on some of the sections in the bill. So we're right at the finish line. It looks like it is. I'm hopeful it's going to be followed right when we're back in session this September, because they're very minor questions, and so I'll be touching base with you, Todd, through email so that we can get those things figured out, and we'll be filing ASAP. And I'm really looking forward to seeing all the grassroots movement around it once it's filed. And happy to answer any questions, of course. So if anyone has any questions, happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Todd, you need to unmute. Sorry.
Well, that's wonderful, Francesco. Thank you so much. So yeah, we don't need to discuss the emails that we're on this last round of things until after we've had a chance to talk on it. I hopefully that all sounded good though to you, and we'll get that worked out back to where we had it. I don't really have any questions. I'm just excited. You're saying, yeah, we're almost at September, so you think we're going to be introducing it soon. So everyone knows, now's the time to go out and look for co-sponsors. This is going to be an uphill climb to get co-sponsors for this, although once we have the final legislation, it'll be at least easier to have that conversation. So several of you have already initiated that. Please continue that outreach because there's so much lag time. But even if we only have a handful or a few when we file, that's fine, because this is going to be a slow drudge through the mud, through the oily mud, one vote at a time, as we see who is going to be on the side of saving the future. And so, now's the time during the election season to ask that question, to get people to up their level of commitment, investment in this, because that's when they feel more accountable to the public. So everything everyone can do on the call right now to help with that would be great. We have about, 75 organizations that have endorsed. Francesco, I haven't gotten I haven't asked for a recent list, but I'll look at that list and see who's missing, and we'll just double down in the next week or two on this outreach. Any thoughts about that effort, Francesco?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have a lot of grassroots support. I think right now we have an eDear colleague also in our system in the House. So other members of the House are aware that we are working on this bill. Hopefully we get some original co-sponsors when we introduce it next month. And then it's just a matter of continuing the dialogue, continuing putting on the pressure on other members, and laying the groundwork for the fights ahead on environmental justice. So looking forward to staying connected. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, everyone, and always happy to answer any questions you may have on the Earth Bill.
Wonderful. Francesco, Chad Frischmann's here. You've just heard his presentation about their analysis. I think it looks like, as the universe has a way of doing this, the bill being ready and the review of the analysis is going to maybe come out at the same time, it looks like. So this is sort of a question for Chad. How's this early September looking, or what's your timeline looking, and what do you think if you're going to be able to have these come out in the same announcement? It's not necessary that they do, but just curious.
Thank you, Todd. I think I will have to get back to you after I review with our analysts and the team. I do know that there are some data challenges, particularly with, as I was mentioning, the regenerative agricultural piece that we need, because it is very complicated.
Sure.
For obvious reasons. I don't know. Ryan, are you here? Are you able to maybe jump in and give us an estimation of, if you're listening, Ryan?
Good morning, everyone. Good day. Yes, I'm here, Chad. Getting that time might be challenging. So you're looking at the early September. Early September might be a bit tight for us, but possibly middle of September, maybe a bit later on, depending on the other members of the team, would be a reasonable target date. We'll certainly try to get the analysis done earlier than that, but it just might be a bit difficult. Yeah, we'll do our best.
No, that's great. That's great. No pressure here. We're all doing this in due course, so it's all great. And it sounds like we'll have the bill finished first, and then we'll introduce it, and then we'll do another big announcement about the analysis. That's great, because we're going to need every bounce along the way to keep this balloon going. So, all right, well, that's wonderful. Francesco, any questions for the drawdown or for the Regenintel team?
Just looking forward to staying in touch. Any way that any of y'all think we can improve the bill, any way in which we can, just ensure that it meets the purpose of bringing down those greenhouse gas emissions. Happy to always get on a call, connect, and thank you for all your support on this.
All right, well, thank you all so much. I see a question from Lavona in the question about the bill. In the Dear Colleague letter, Lavona, Francesco's email is listed there. But here it is. Is okay, Francesco, I'll put it in the chat.
Yes. So if you reach out to your members of Congress, please use that Dear Colleague, include my email so they can get in touch with our office. Yes, happy to share that.
And all this information for reaching out to your, let's see where, I'll put it in here in a second. Here it is. All the information on how to reach out to your legislative office to co-sponsor, and the Dear Colleague letter and all of that is in the link on our website, on the Earth Bill website under actions. So if you have any questions about how to go about it, you should find all the materials you need there, or never hesitate to email me. All right, well, with that all said, we're gonna have to move on. Thank you, Team Earth Bill. I'm getting excited again and I'm hopeful again. And so I'm very much looking forward to our big events in September. I think we're rolling right on the right crest of this wave. We've accomplished, a big milestone. People see that for what it is good, but it's the beginning. And we're hitting, I think, that political conversation right at the right moment in terms of going to have a conversation about mandates and timelines. So thank you all again a million times for everything you've all done and all the groups that have supported this to date and brought us to where we are. Each one of your individual endorsements of the bill has been a brick upon which we built this step by step by step. And so thank you everyone so far. And next up, we'll move on now. I want to invite Mahajan of Energy Innovation to join us. Thank you, Megan, for being here today and for all the amazing work that Energy Innovation has done to help us understand the greenhouse gas impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act. Your numbers and analysis help seal the deal, really, in terms of supporting the IRA for many people. And I'm just thrilled that we have science in the mix for this policy and strategy debate. So in advance, I shared several questions with you. I hope that wasn't overwhelming. But our main hope today is to get really smarter about greenhouse gas modeling, generally, the underlying assumptions, particularly how tax incentives and rebates impact clean energy development and consumer uptake. And it would be great to explore how we'll measure the results in real time each year so we can know if we're on track to meet projections. We're also eager to know what more is needed in terms of policy or pollution mandates, putting this all in the context of global emissions and the timelines to stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees global warming. This is obviously just a short list with huge questions, so I don't expect you to cover it all. And I hope I didn't scare you away with them in my email. I'm just really grateful that you're here and for all the work you're doing and the role that science is playing in our policy problem solving. It's so refreshing and necessary. Thank you.
Oh, well, thanks, Todd. Happy to be here. I will try to cover as many of the questions as I can while leaving hopefully a little bit of time at the end for any follow-up questions. But with that, let me just go ahead and share some slides to give you all a high-level overview of the modeling work that we did on the Inflation Reduction Act. Can you all see my screen at this point? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So my name is Megan Mahajan. I am our modeling and analysis manager at Energy Innovation. So we are a nonpartisan climate and energy policy firm. And my role within the organization is really focused on analytics. So understanding what the emissions and cost and health impacts and benefits are of different climate and energy policies, and what we need to do to stay on track to meet our climate goals. So obviously we were quite interested in modeling out what the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act would be. So I'm sure many of you here have dug into some of the details, but at a high level, there's a lot in this bill. Some of the big pieces are tax credits for clean energy technologies and clean manufacturing. So not only encouraging the manufacturing of the types of materials we need for clean energy technologies, but making sure that those jobs are centered in the US. Funding for different emissions reduction programs across different sectors of the economy, a fee on methane from oil and gas producers, a green bank to fund different clean energy projects. But as many of you know, there are also some not so great pieces in the bill, such as oil and gas leasing requirements. So requiring that oil and gas leases be offered. And we modeled that as well, trying to understand what might be negative impacts as well as all of the positive impacts of this bill. So not going to go through this list, but this is just to show all of the different sections of the bill that we modeled in our analysis. This is not everything in the bill, but we really tried to touch on all the pieces that we thought would affect emissions and were specific enough for us to model. So just a bit about the background and the method that we take when approaching something like this. This is done using our in-house model that we developed called the Energy Policy Simulator. And so this is a model that's really designed to understand the impacts of policies and especially how they work together and not double counting what might be overlapping effects of different pieces of legislation. So to model something like this, or to build up our model, we take in a lot of data. We try to take in data from government or other published sources wherever we can. So much of this is based on the Energy Information Administration's annual energy outlook. They provide just a vast source of data for energy use and technology sales and such across the economy. As well as other sources like technology costs. We're making sure we're taking the most up-to-date information there from different national laboratories and so on. So we are constructing first a business as usual case to understand what our baseline is. And so we make sure to wrap in all federal and state policies into that case. So this includes the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Sorry, was there a question? So this includes IIJA. I will note that we don't see that legislation having a huge emissions impact, but it has a lot of really important enabling pieces, such as setting up the infrastructure like electric vehicle chargers and transmission that's going to facilitate the clean energy transition. We include the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, which touches on fluorinated gases, so those high global warming potential gases and things like air conditioners. Also the more recent EPA greenhouse gas standards for vehicles and state level policies such as clean electricity targets at the state level. Our model from there, taking in all that kind of data, decides what electricity is generated, what new power plants are constructed, and what new vehicles are sold based on costs. And so we see, you know, as costs come lower, we see more and more wind and solar and electric vehicles being deployed. And that is partially what leads us to, in our business as usual scenario, achieving 25% below 2005 greenhouse gas levels by 2030. So just a note on that, because you'll see these references to emissions reductions in 2030 compared to 2005. That terminology is because of how the United States has set its climate goals. So its nationally determined contribution to the Paris Climate Agreement is relative to 2005 levels. Typically, countries benchmark their climate goals based on some historical year's value. And our target is 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. And this is about on a straight line path to net zero greenhouse gases by 2050, which is in line with what the IPCC says is necessary to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. though important, of course, to note that that is all in a global context, and obviously different countries have been responsible for different amounts of emissions historically, and so there can be some debate on exactly, what the target should be for individual countries. But our goal is 50 to 52% by 2030 right now, and you can see even in a business as usual scenario, we're part of the way there, based on how technology costs are falling and how that has been affecting what technologies are deployed. So that's a bit about how we construct our business as usual scenario, and then we start to layer policies on top of that. So, if we set a standard for how clean electricity is going to evolve, how does that affect fuel demand? How does that flow through the economy, et cetera? And we can layer on multiple different policies and understand their combined impact. And the key outputs that come out of our model are not only emissions of both greenhouse gases and other particulate and criteria emissions that will have an impact on public health. So we can use that to have to look at health impacts. We're also tracking the costs of all these different policies. So we have economic impacts, and that allows us to also calculate what the jobs impacts and what the GDP and consumer savings are, for example. So with that, I'll just share some about the actual results of our modeling for the IRA. So here you can see emissions from 2005 to 2030, again, showing 2005, since that's our benchmark for our country's climate targets. You can see emissions have been falling. And then here we kind of get into our projections. So in our business as usual case, we see emissions still steadily falling to this 25% below. But you can see we have a low, a moderate, and high version of our scenario for our Inflation Reduction Act. And this seriously bends the curve down, and we're getting between 37 to 43% below 2005 values. So this is not all the way to our 50 to 52% goal. It will be important to have additional action in this country in the form of things like federal regulation, so things like EPA standards on vehicles, or additional action on methane in the oil and gas industry. And state action, state and local action as well, can be really important to filling in that gap. But as you can see, this is a serious dent in emissions as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. And as I mentioned, this does include the emissions contribution from additional oil and gas drilling that we modeled. So while we do see a negative impact from that in terms of emissions, that's outweighed in terms of greenhouse gases by all of the other emissions reductions in the bill. Although, of course, there are important local pollution considerations to where that additional oil and gas drilling might be occurring. In terms of where are these greenhouse gas emissions reductions coming from, you can see the vast majority of the reductions are in the power sector, these gray bars here. Although we also see large reductions in the agriculture sector. There are a lot of incentives in here for climate smart agricultural practices. In the industrial sector, through things like encouraging clean procurement and cleaner manufacturing, in addition to incentives for carbon capture and sequestration in industry. And then something that might be a little surprising is the lower numbers for the buildings and transportation sectors. Couple of reasons here. In transportation particularly, because of the incentive structure. So there are some requirements around what vehicles can qualify for tax credits based on things like, was the vehicle produced in the United States? Were any of the materials in the battery produced outside the United States and countries like China? In those cases, those vehicles won't qualify for the credits, and we see that lessening the impact potentially in the long term. And then stock turnover is another important piece. So vehicles last for a long time, they stay on the road. So even if we hit 100% sales of electric vehicles tomorrow, there are going to be gasoline vehicles on the road for the next decade or so as they turn over. And so you do see a bit of a delayed impact. So the the size of this transportation bar would grow if you're looking out towards 2035 or 2040 or so, just due to that stock turnover effect. And then just looking at what's remaining after these impacts. So here you can see in the gray that we've gotten a big chunk out of the electricity sector. We have seen impacts in other sectors, but smaller in terms of the overall impact. So some more work to do, of course, but this is, a pretty significant reduction, especially in electricity. Just zooming in on the electricity bit a bit more, we see large increases in the share of electricity that is from clean sources as a result of this bill. So the primary drivers here are the clean energy tax credits. And then there is also a lot of funding for retiring fossil fuel assets like coal plants and replacing them with wind and solar. So we have a range of 72 to 85% clean electricity in our modeling between our scenarios, as compared to a 49% share of clean electricity in our business as usual case. And that is due to kind of tailoring the effectiveness of some of this funding for retiring fossil fuel assets, and also varying the amount of tax credits that developers can claim, again, because of some of those requirements in place for domestic content, for new power plants, as well as things like union labor requirements. So varying how much tax credit availability there might be due to those types of requirements. But also just important to note that these projections aren't factoring in very real non-monetary constraints, things like siting and permitting in order to connect all these new sources of wind and solar to the grid and get the transmission set up. And so focusing on implementation and making sure that developers can take advantage of all of these incentives will be really important moving forward. I also just wanted to highlight some of the other important benefits in addition to emissions. So we see an increase of 1.2 to 1.3 million jobs in the year 2030, concentrated in the services, manufacturing, trade, and construction sectors. And this might even be an underestimate, because this is an accounting for changes that might happen because of these domestic content requirements that I've been talking about, which will really encourage more industry to develop in the US to provide things like solar panels and batteries for vehicles. We're also projecting average household energy savings of about $80 per year by 2030, primarily due to lower electricity costs, because we have all these incentives for clean, cheap electricity, but also some savings due to changes in fuel prices, because we're going to see a drop in fossil fuel demand, which will have an impact on pricing. And then finally, but really importantly, health benefits. So we see large reductions in health impacts because of avoided fossil fuel combustion, which has a lot of particulate emissions. So you can see a lot of impacts for things like avoided asthma attacks, lost work days, heart attacks, etc. And an exciting benefit to point out is that when we're looking at the avoided premature mortalities from this bill, we see the benefits concentrated in communities of color. So you can see on a percent change basis, the decrease in premature mortalities is greater for people identifying as Black, Asian, or other race as compared to people identifying as white. That's it for the prepared slides that I had in terms of results. But before wrapping, I know Todd mentioned there might be some questions around how do we track progress on this bill? How do we look in the future to see if we're on track for our goals? So we do currently have several government agencies tracking a lot of the key metrics that we would want to look at, which for us in the modeling community is super important in what we use to make sure all of our modeling is up to date. So for example, the EPA puts out an inventory of greenhouse gases annually. looking at where all of the emissions are coming from in the economy every year and how that's changing over time. The Energy Information Administration tracks a lot of data, especially in the power sector. So looking at what power plants are dispatching electricity, what new plants are being planned for and retiring, and so on. And they do that at the state level, which is really helpful also for tracking state progress on things like their clean electricity targets. And also agencies like the Department of Energy will put out reports to show the progress and the estimated impacts in terms of emissions or costs based on programs that it has been funded to implement. And so those types of things are going to be really important moving forward for us in the modeling community to take in and analyze and make sure that we are tracking with how we see these projections moving forward, and understanding what else is needed to hit our goal. What do we need to fill that gap to that 50 to 52% target by 2030, and looking even further, what do we need to be on track for a net zero by 2050 timeline? So with that, I will just pause and see if there's any questions.
No, I don't think there'll be any questions. We could spend all day talking about this, obviously, and it's going to be the conversation that really is one of the core conversations as we go forward as a society trying to solve this problem. So thank you for that basic introduction. I was just wondering if you could unpack for us a little bit this 2005 and 50% by two. Well, I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I look at all these numbers, I'm like, oh my gosh, all these internal reference points are designed to throw us off. I like absolute numbers. So I'm like, okay, and I'm not even confused between, I'm going to show my ignorance, everybody, MMT, metric tons of CO2, and then the parts per million, and then the 1.5 and 2. So I know those parts per million correspond to 1.5 and 2. So how does the MMT CO2 translate into parts per million, translate to 1.5? And why are we using 2005 as a baseline? And why not 1990? I know that I looked at a chart recently. I saw 1990, 2002, and it sort of went like this and back down. And we sort of ended up where we were in 1990, I think, ish. So why did we pick the high water mark? And, you know, so what's the game here? And are there absolute numbers that we can somehow turn to and say, okay, this is the scale that we should all be using so we're not confused?
Yeah, so it is a bit tricky because ppm, so parts per million, refers to the atmospheric concentration of CO2, which obviously is a global phenomenon. So that is a result of what all the countries around the world are emitting, and is a little bit complicated because we have emissions of CO2, but there are also other greenhouse gases like methane, those fluorinated gases that have a really high global warming potential that I mentioned. And all of those have a different impact on temperature based on how long-lived they are in the atmosphere. And so because of all that, it's a little bit simpler to talk about emissions from a million metric tons perspective. And you will often see it, as we have reported it, in terms of CO2 equivalent. And so that is adjusting for the fact that there are these other greenhouse gases like methane that have a higher global warming potential. And so we kind of convert it all to be in terms of the impact of a ton of CO2, which is the dominant greenhouse gas emitted. And so countries will set their climate targets in terms of their individual emissions, because it's really hard to parse apart what the impact on the global temperature will be, because that's dependent on all the countries at the same time rather than, you know, just the United States. And you are right that it is a bit, there's not a whole lot of guidance in terms of the IPCC, which all countries submit their nationally determined contributions or their climate targets to. There is no requirement to benchmark it against a single year. A lot of countries will use 1990, some use 2010, the US uses 2005. It was kind of about our high point for emissions, which I think has that's one of the reasons why it's selected as the US's benchmark. But the IPCC, in terms of setting guidance on what's needed, has a lot of atmospheric scientists that can say, okay, we want the temperature to be this, therefore the atmospheric concentration should be about this ppm. This is what we need in terms of emissions in MMT to get there. And we want to get to about net zero emissions by 2050 is kind of our high level target, and how we can go from thinking about temperature to emissions in terms of tons. I hope that was somewhat helpful. It's a pretty complicated subject to try to parse out.
Yeah, I think that is helpful. So can you tell us then how many metric tons of CO2 the United States should reduce emissions by an absolute number by 2030 to be on this trajectory? But I'm still curious about this trajectory, and I know that there's a lot of discussion around net zero as a construct, and whether that's even feasible, because you're rubbing from Peter to pay Paul, I think, in that scenario. So is that the right standard, or should we just be focusing on millions of metric tons, whatever the MMT stands for, and some absolute numbers? And then just a little bit, if you can, about the United States' role in that number. So how much metric ton CO2 equivalent should we be reducing by a certain date because of our current emissions, and then also our historic responsibility?
Yeah, so if you translate that 50 to 52% goal to million metric tons, that's a goal of emitting about 3,300 to 3,400, or I believe about 3,300 million metric tons in the year 2030. And then the goal in terms of net zero would be then 0 million metric tons by 2050. Although that is accounting for the fact that we do have emission sinks. So like our forestry sector, that does allow us to still be emitting some, but offsetting it by natural lands in 2050. So that's kind of the absolute number. But again, there is no formal guidance from the IPCC on exactly what the responsibility is of each country based on their historical emissions. And so there's a ranging opinion of, maybe globally we should be getting to net zero by 2050, but the US has a responsibility to move faster than that because we've emitted a larger share of the historical emissions. And so basically the answer is as fast as possible to decarbonize.
Yeah. Right. All right. Well, okay. Well, this is the beginning of that next level of conversation, I think. And there are probably more questions in the chat. And if you are able to stick around and look at those and reply to folks, that would be wonderful. But feel no obligation to do so. I'll definitely invite you back as time goes on. I would just say that it would be helpful for activists if we could just see it laid out in these metric tons, I think, numbers. And then these policies are going to reduce this many metric tons. Here's the differential. Here's what we need to meet those metric tons. And that kind of thing would help us just have a clearer idea of where we are in this effort. The only other thing I would add is, there's a big difference between incentives and then pollution mandates like the EPA would have, or a law that would have mandate an end to greenhouse gas pollution and have timing associated with that. When you're modeling these things, what would you say the variation is on these assumptions, and how dependent upon they are they on macroeconomic factors? And how do we really know that $7,500 electric vehicle credit will make somebody buy a big EV? So, I just have a million more questions we could go into. I don't want to get you into all of them now, but if there are any closing thoughts on those broader questions, how does this incentive approach compare to a mandates approach in terms of estimating with absolute certainty what's going to happen?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it does make it a little harder to model, which is why you can see a fairly big range in the impacts that we projected between our low and our high scenarios. So something like a mandate is a lot more straightforward to model. You need to get this percentage of clean electricity by this year, plug it into the model, and it will find the most cost-effective way to meet that goal. With incentives, our approach was to vary the assumptions that went into the model between the different scenarios. So things like, well, how much of this tax credit is actually going to be available for consumers to take based on these different requirements for manufacturing? Or in the clean electricity sector, how much will actually be adopted based on some of those non-monetary constraints that I talked about, such as siting and permitting? Maybe we don't want to assume that every developer is going to take the most cost-effective option, because there are some real world limitations. And so it's important to do that kind of sensitivity analysis to have a more conservative and a more optimistic scenario when you're doing something like this, because it is quite hard to predict. But I think the underlying takeaway is that no matter how you look on it, this is a pretty serious reduction in costs for clean energy technologies, and really puts them at a competitive advantage in terms of adoption. And so we will be seeing some impact, and it's going to be pretty transformative. It's just how big is that impact going to be?
Because you have historical data on this. I mean, there have already been incentives, particularly with the clean energy. I mean, usually it's standards, which is much easier, obviously. But there have been financial incentives for a while at the federal level. So you have a track record of what that did. And do you use that basis as the basis for the projection?
That data is available and helpful to look at, but also costs have just on their own fallen a lot since even just in the past decade. So you're already looking at unsubsidized wind and solar being even cheaper than fossil fuel resources. And so it's kind of a whole new world in terms of add these incentives on top of those already really cheap costs. And there's just an incredible advantage for wind and solar, which is very exciting.
Great, great, great. Well, this is all very exciting. And again, thank you so much. And you and Energy Innovation and the other Princeton and the other organizations that are modeling this. I've been involved in policy advocacy for a long time, and I've seen a million arguments about this idea or that idea. We never had science to come in and say, oh, well, if you do this, you're going to get X. So that really is extremely, it's a new variable in public policy debate that couldn't be more important. So you're bringing the science to the policy, and I just, as a lawyer, I'm very grateful for that. And as an activist too, because it helps us get real about this conversation. So thank you, thank you.
Yes, and unfortunately, I am going to have to jump. I see a bunch of awesome questions coming in, which I wish I could respond to, but I do have another call to hop to, so.
No worries about that. We'll invite you back, and I'm sure this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation. Thank you again so much for all you do.
All right. Thank you, Todd. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Well, guys, we go into a lot of heavy stuff here, as you can tell, and we probably spend a whole day on each one of these topics. But now we're going to go and welcome Sarah Carden from Farm Action Fund, which is formerly Family Farm Action, who we worked with a lot in the past. And Sarah's on the front line of the Farm Bill organizing and is going to take us into that arena. That bill will be taken up next year in the new Congress, but the organizing for that work has already begun. We'll see over time how we fit into all of this. I know people in the faith community and Livona are excited about this front. But it is part of our underlying strategy to work across sectors to build more power. Culture and farming, and why the Earth Bill tackles it. But farming and land use and soil health are obviously all fundamental to survival. And here again, we have a right as consumers to shape the practices that provide our food so that the practices sustain us into the future. But as with many areas, big ag controls the agenda. So this conversation is going to get us started on the path to building our own power as a broader environmental community and advocacy world. And we'll see where it all goes as we embark on yet another Herculean effort in the next year of fighting for the Farm Bill, a fair Farm Bill, as Sarah's group has put it. And we welcome you, Sarah. Thank you so much for being here and for all the work you guys have already done. That Fair Farm Bill report is a fabulous starting point for this path and advocacy, and for helping us to align and understand what our demands are going into this journey. So we welcome you, and we're excited to hear everything you have to say.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I put together just a little slide deck. I don't know, some of you may have worked on past farm bills. Some of you may be unfamiliar with it. So let me see. I'm going to just share this with you and take you all on a little brief presentation, and then hopefully I can answer some questions. Hold on. All right, are you guys all seeing this? Excellent.
Yes.
Again, my name is Sarah Carden. I am the policy advocate at Farm Action. We are a organization that focuses on promoting a fair food and farm system that benefits farmers and consumers and our communities instead of just a handful of corporations. So we engage really heavily. The upcoming farm bill is really a top priority for us right now. So the Farm Bill, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is an enormous package of legislation. It is typically passed every 5 years, and it has a tremendous impact on our food and farm system. It covers programs ranging from crop insurance for farmers to food assistance programs for low-income families. Its programs directly impact what food is grown, how it is grown, who is producing it, and generally what food will end up on the consumer's plate. While it's called the Farm Bill, many refer to it as the Food Bill because it impacts everyone's lives. And given that it only comes up for reauthorization every 5 years, it is a tremendous opportunity for advocacy that really should not go overlooked. So the structure of the Farm Bill does change from every farm bill to farm bill sometimes, but it's likely that this 2023 Farm Bill will follow the same structure as the 2018 one with 12 titles. The 2018 Farm Bill expires in 2023, which is why we are gearing up right now. And both the House and Senate Ag committees have begun hearings exploring the newest Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill is drafted. So there's the House and Senate both have ag committees who are responsible for drafting the Farm Bill. So it's always a good idea to find out if your representatives sit on those communities, and especially if they are in leadership positions, then they will have an outsized role on what does end up in and out of the Farm Bill. And so, people who live in Michigan, for instance, where Chair Stabenow lives, you need to get in her ear and let her know what matters to you. So the Farm Bill authorizes two different kinds of funding, mandatory and discretionary. The programs provided with mandatory funding are provided with funds as needed and are not subject to annual appropriations decisions by Congress. Programs authorized with discretionary funding may be funded up to the level provided by that legislation, but Congress may change the funding level each year for these programs. So for that reason, most of the Farm Bill debate tends to focus on the mandatory programs, but discretionary programs are so important. It's sort of like a way to get programs in oftentimes, and then over time we can advocate to get them to reach mandatory status. It's a really big bill. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that the total cost of the 2018 Farm Bill will be $428 billion over its 5-year duration. But it's also important to note that the spending is not equally distributed throughout the titles. 4 of the titles account for 99% of anticipated Farm Bill spending: nutrition, crop insurance, commodities, and conservation. And of those 4, nutrition is using about 76% of the mandatory spending, with its major program being SNAP. As I've mentioned, the 2023 Farm Bill presents this once and every 5-year opportunity for all voters to advocate for their food system, for their communities, and for their health. And so at Farm Action, we have re-envisioned a farm bill that works for everyone, not just a handful of corporations. And we have organized our campaign into four pillars. Our first pillar, Food Not Feed, we advocate for farm support programs to shift their focus away from the support of feed for intensive livestock and poultry production and towards the production of nutrient-dense food for human consumption. We outline clear policy recommendations that would help catalyze this transition, such as expanding crop insurance options for specialty crop and diversified operations, establishing payment limits on risk management and commodity programs, and increasing research funding toward transition programs. In our second pillar, Justice for All, we confront USDA's acknowledged history of racial discrimination, which has resulted in fewer BIPOC-owned farms feeding their communities healthy, affordable food. BIPOC communities have significantly higher rates of dietary-related disease, and higher proportions of their communities live in food deserts and food swamps. And we need a food system that works to address and confront its history of systemic racism through programs that enhance marginalized communities' ability to grow and purchase nutrient-dense foods. In our third pillar, Build Local, Eat Local, we focus on policies that build up regional and local food systems and infrastructure by strengthening labeling integrity, stripping corporations of their excessive market power and control of food supply chains, and investing in local and regional food systems. We will build a more resilient food system that allows for consumers to support farming practices that benefit community health. And finally, our fourth pillar, conservation and regeneration. We advocate for supports for organic and regenerative farming. And I'm going to spend the remaining time focusing on that pillar today. So as discussed, the Farm Bill has a huge effect on the way our food is produced. It funds all of USDA's conservation programs, and through these programs has been able to incentivize certain practices. That said, simply offering programs that farmers can opt into is just not enough. At Farm Action, we are calling for an institutional redesign. Our current farm system incentivizes all sorts of practices indirectly. So through crop insurance and other subsidies, the last several farm bills have been written to support and prioritize corn, soy production, along with that of some other commodity crops. And by incentivizing and consequently flooding the market with these crops, the vast majority of which go to animal feed, they reduce the operational expenses of multinational meatpacking conglomerates and funnel these profits into the pockets of their CEOs. We call this the feed meat complex. Meanwhile, consumers are facing record high prices for meat and other food items, and farmers' profits have been squeezed out on either end. And what's more, these practices that our government promotes have severe consequences on our environment. They've polluted our waters, our air, and eroded our soils. So in our re-envisioned food and farming system, we urge legislators to tie federal farm supports to conservation practices. Not only will this incentivize farmers to consider adopting more environmentally friendly farming practices, but it also makes sense economically that farmers who are being financially supported through climate-related disasters and change should be making efforts not to contribute further to factors that will increase these changes. So, and that brings up a new piece of legislation, which I had shared with Todd, and was, I think, how I ended up here, that we are very excited to see, called the Conservation Opportunity and Voluntary Environment Resilience Program, shorthand COVER Act. We were really excited when we saw Representatives Carden and Axon introduce this a few weeks ago. This legislation begins to model the exact kind of connection that we've been advocating for between farm supports and conservation practices. The COVER Act creates a program that's modeled after a successful pilot from pandemic funding called the Pandemic Cover Crop Program that offers farmers a $5 discount on their crop insurance premiums for every acre they plant and cover crops. It also contains funding for technical assistance and outreach, which is a huge issue for many farmers who are it's not familiar with how to may not know the technical details or benefits of cover cropping. And finally, it also creates the soil health pilot program, which looks to incentivize other good soil health practices in a similar fashion, acknowledging that cover cropping can be tremendously beneficial, but it may not is limited by in certain regions like out west where they're going to have where it's very dry. So not only do we like this bill for tying conservation to farm supports, but we also like its support of cover cropping in general. For those of you unfamiliar, cover cropping is a farming practice that builds soil health, structure, and fertility, and has been proven to reduce and remove farmers' dependence on synthetic fertilizers and agrochemicals. This is good for the environment as well as good for our farming system. These fertilizer agrochemical corporations have become highly consolidated and have been squeezing farmers' profits increasingly over the years. So right now, Representatives Carden and Axon are currently working on securing Republican co-sponsors, and we have been collecting organizational endorsements on their behalf, and we really sincerely hope you will consider supporting this bill. So in closing, I really want to take a moment to direct you to Farm Action's Farm Bill campaign's landing page, which is full of supporting materials for this presentation, including a Farm Bill primer, our Fair Farm Bill Policy Handbook, a toolkit, and I'm just going to see if I can take you all here for a minute. Let's see. Okay. So if you guys look, this is our landing page, and we've got testimonial videos on it. So the primer is a lot of for those of you new to the Farm Bill and trying to engage and hearing terms you may not be familiar with, you're going to find a lot of that information in our Farm Bill primer. We also, Todd mentioned we have this handbook. We encourage you all to send this to your legislators. You can download it and email it. We have a button on our landing page where you can just click and it'll send it to your representatives. But it outlines all of our policy recommendations by the 4 pillars I discussed. So for some of you may be more interested, or your representatives may be more interested in specific pillars, and you can highlight those for them. We talked a lot today about our conservation regeneration pillar and our main objective to require to tie Farm Bill supports to conservation practices. We're also advocating for financial and technical support for farmers transitioning their practices, as well as improved transparency, and it's all kind of clickable, and you can go there and get the more detailed info there. Here's that email your legislator feature. And then the other thing I want to share with you all is this toolkit we have, which includes all of those materials, along with we have fact sheets for a number of bills that we call that are marker bills for the Farm Bill, and they're all included in here, unbranded and downloadable, so you can edit them, redistribute them as suits your purposes. You just have to sign up here, and we'll share the link with you. And then we have here's some of our testimonials, and I'll drop the link in the chat in a second, but that's sort of my brief, quick Farm Bill 101. I'll give you guys screens back, and happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Sarah. That's very exciting, and it's a very exciting opportunity. Maybe you could talk just a little bit more about the organizing framework. I know the Progressive Congressional Caucus is organizing. We talked about that. I'm not sure if the other, I guess we call them the fossil fuel coalitions, the environmental coalitions working on that side of things are involved yet. But what's the organizing plan look like? How do you envision civil society and grassroots activists and local organizers plugging in? And are there going to be meetings? What space will there be for this conversation over the next several months into next year? So how do you see that all shaping up, and how we can plug in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's going to be a number of different ways you all can engage. I would recommend like I said, the House and Senate Ag committees have already started hosting field hearings and listening sessions. They just had one, I think it was yesterday, it's been a long week, in Ohio, that we had a couple of our vice president testified at, along with we manage sort of a network of advocates, and we have a representative there. So that's a great, if you find out that there's one in your region, I highly recommend getting up there. We are going to be, we are at Farm Action sitting on a number of sort of broader stakeholder groups right now. We've been highly engaged with the CPC, as Todd mentioned, with a very specific purpose of trying to help. We have found in past farm bills that progressives tend to be very well educated on the nutrition title and not as well educated on some of the other titles. And we want to make sure that they are informed and feel confident advocating for other important programs, not at the expense of nutrition, but in addition to that. We are going to be organizing a coalition of state groups that we will be launching probably following the midterm elections. And we would be happy to invite anybody here into that coalition once we get that off the ground. Yeah, so I think, those are great ways to start to engage or to, organize within your own communities as well. Start to make people aware how, and that's why we have these materials that, not everyone realizes how much the Farm Bill will affect everyone, not just farmers, not just low-income Americans. It really affects everybody, and that's important.
All right, great. Well, we have Lavona Grow on the call, who heads up our faith team, and I know that she's been talking about this for quite a while now. Lavona, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Hi. Hi, Sarah. We actually talked back in March, and this is great information. Just want to let folks also know that Hey Zone is doing a big campaign. I can put a link in there about that. I've shared already this information with the Washington Interreligious Staff Committee that's working on ecology and energy, and I'm actually heading up the Farm Bill working group, which is very interesting in this. We will have faith principles on the Farm Bill, and would love to chat with you as we develop those, and we'll be doing a briefing for the larger group. So just really the question that Todd had put to you is kind of one is how we engage in the organizing efforts, and we're small and mighty, but we want to have the opportunity to know about these other opportunities to participate in. So we're also looking at a very faith lens, specifically the one on environmental justice would be of great concern. But we do find that the faith community also is not very educated on this issue. We know about SNAP, and that's been about it. So wherever you see those opportunities, and let's keep in touch. Thanks.
Great.
Yeah, I'm great. Glad to, Lavona, I've been meaning to reach out to you for a follow-up since we talked quite a while ago. So.
Quite a while ago, yeah, back in March.
And I was only a couple months in Farm Action at the time.
Yeah, that's right. You're new to it. Well, we'll follow up.
Okay.
Let's keep in conversation. Thanks very much. And if you'd like to speak with the WISC group, these are the heads, the denominational folks that are here in Washington, the lobby on this issue. I can set something up online. If you're interested, just let me know.
Yeah, that would be terrific.
Great. Take care.
Wonderful. Well, that's what we do here. We're trying to connect the dots and the moving parts and the experts with the activists on the ground. I think I had one little quick question before we let you go. So it's like this cover bill says $5, basically $5 off if you per acre. What percentage of the acre cost is that? So like, what is the premium usually for an acre of health insurance, if that's not too technical?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because it's really it's really variable. But I think it it can be, as low as $5 an acre, which is kind of one of the reasons that, so, adopting cover cropping, especially at first, your initial upfront costs are more than $5 an acre, and we've, reached out to our network of farmers, and it's not really, it is some financial, incentive, but, if you're just going to run the numbers on, well, to plant these cover crops, it's going to cost me, this number of dollars per acre, which also is going to vary if you're organic or which cover crops you're using, but that can, be anywhere from $20 to $200 to $500 an acre. And so, but when you're looking at scales, farms have just the average size of farms that this bill is really targeting have gone up tremendously. And so, you have a 2,000 acre farm and $5 an acre, that's a $10,000 discount. So it's definitely not nothing. And it can, in some ways, negate your crop insurance, which is one of the things that they've been doing is collecting data to show, and that's sort of another speaking point to this bill, that it pays for itself, because in adopting cover cropping, farmers are going to have reduced crop insurance claims. And so that is, it ends up paying for itself through those reductions in claims, and they're in the process of collecting more and more data to substantiate that. But that's what they're able to show on a small scale right now.
And then one other question, and I didn't queue this up for you, so feel free to dodge it if you don't want to answer. But the IRA had a lot of funding for for agricultural practices, and so, do you have any top line bullet points from that? What was there and how that might dovetail into all of this?
Yeah, sure. So it didn't, the IRA kind of started, it was like a slimmed down version of Build Back Better, which had some cover crop funding in it. It didn't get that funding. But it did have about just shy of $20 billion for the USDA's conservation programs, EQIP, CSP, CRP, REAP, and that's a huge influx of spending. And there's a couple really key good things in that. For instance, the money, and I don't have the exact breakdown of who got how much of that $20 billion on me, but I think EQIP got about $7 billion or something, and they usually have a 50% set aside for livestock, which that set aside was removed in this in the IRA, which means that in the past, all EQIP funding, 50% of it has had to go to livestock, which has been the main way that the government has been supporting biodigesters. And at Farm Action, we strongly believe that biodigesters are really creating a market, or they're creating a demand for methane, and instead of reducing instead of having carbon savings, they're actually creating incentives to produce more harmful practices and grow CAFO operations. And so we were really glad, along with a number of other advocates, to see that 50% livestock set aside removed from that money. A big part of our Farm Bill campaign has been advocating for increasing funds for those programs. So that, given that it's going to probably be a closed Farm Bill, they're not going to increase funding. That would have meant shifting it from other places. So it's great to see that funding already there. It also means that, worst case scenario, if a Farm Bill is not reauthorized on time, what happens in the past is that means those programs would be shut down. Those programs now have funding that's been authorized to go on past that. But all of that said, another big part of our Farm Bill campaign has been advocating for reforms to those programs to make sure that they really are funding the kinds of practices and operations that they're supposed to be. There's various studies that have shown anywhere from 50 to 75% of the programs that they are, of the kinds of practices they're supporting, are not actually climate reducing or conservation practices. And so we've been advocating for reforms on how they and huge numbers of applicants, they're over enrolled, subscribed. So huge number of applicants, 2/3 or 75% or something get rejected when they apply. So we've been working on reforms to make sure that the people who are practicing the kinds of farming that is going to benefit the climate and benefit the environment are receiving those funds.
All right, excellent.
Yeah. Oh, and there's one more thing in there.
Please go ahead.
The debt relief for Black farmers also got written into there. So it's been so in the the American Recovery Program Act, there was debt relief was granted to Black farmers but then challenged in the courts. And so there's been sort of a reworked version of this that was passed in the Inflation Reduction Act, that it just includes, I think, $2 or $3 billion for individuals who can prove that they have been discriminated against by the USDA, as well as another $2 or $3 billion for farmers who are economically distressed due to USDA loans. And so, it's a little controversial of a fix, but we're glad to see that they are pushing something through, because there's been a lot of people kind of sitting in limbo during this period of challenge, who were told their debt was relieved, and then that actually, no, you have to pay this. And it's been a real big mess in the Black farming community. And so we were glad to see that being addressed.
All right, that's good. All interesting progress. We are way over time, but I just wanted to ask, did any of climate smart agriculture provisions from Cory Booker's bill make it into the IRA? I haven't looked myself.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly, but all of the funding that went into the USDA programs, the conservation programs, was flat earmarked for climate friendly practices. It all has that earmark on it. The question is how they define that. And that's where we need to step in.
Well, great. All right. Well, that's all positive news, but a big fight ahead of us, right? Let's everybody, what I've learned in this journey, unexpectedly, after we had already drafted the Earth Bill and put the agriculture provision in there, and even though it was focused on big ag only, what I've learned is that big ag has a lockjaw grip on Congress, or headlock on Congress, both Democrat and Republican. So we're in another huge uphill battle against the political status quo, which has not changed, and will actually be more disadvantageous depending on which way the House goes next year. So, we're going to be in a David versus Goliath fight again, but it's an opportunity for us to unite and join forces, fight the good fight, see how much progress can be made, just like we did this past round with the IRA. But every incremental benefit is great, and then learning to work together and collaborate on our advocacy and set higher and more powerful demands in motion. All of this is the process that we're in, building up to greater showdowns in the future. So it's it's sort of a necessary journey that we have to go in, and as Sarah says, it's once every 5 years. So we'll see how we can participate and support, and we'll just get into it. I would love to get the idea of mandates on big ag into that conversation, just to help tilt the whole conversation a little bit. I think it's always good to go in there with some arguments and some policy positions that make people nervous and that sort of shift the ground out from how steady they all are on basically maintaining the status quo. So we can continue those conversations later. That's obviously a high level strategic decision. But the Earth Bill will hopefully be in the mix, and we'll jointly be pushing for these things, bringing that idea into the conversation. So with that, I think we need to close up our official meeting. Generally, we stay on and chit chat. So anyone on our inside team who would like to stay and talk a little bit about what our project, where things stand, or any questions you have, I'm happy to stay on the call and let's do a little debrief. It's almost time, or past time, for us to have smaller meetings again where we talk strategy amongst ourselves. I've been waiting for the Earth Bill to get filed so that we could go into sort of a new full court press of organizing. As you know, many of you were very involved in the work that just happened. So congratulations and thank you to all of you who did that again. I don't feel like we're taking much of a breath, and we're just going to get right back to work. So bravo, everyone, and thank you for always being here. And with that, we'll conclude today's meeting